Hello, this is Father Rich. I'm back in the living room at the Rectory of Our Lady of Peace. I'm actually before the screen of a movie that was made out of the next masterpiece, and quite a few, over a dozen different movies and series were done on this masterpiece. It was called Pride and Prejudice, the novel by Jane Austen from 1813. And they kind of talk about how Jane Austen was a very kind of unassuming person and very kind of quiet and timid and surprising, these novels that she came up with. She only lived to be 41 years old, but between the years of 11 and 1818, she had a stretch of books that she wrote that they say the author of this our book says that few comparable stretches of such fertile literary accomplishment. The first was Sense and Sensibility, also made into movies and somewhat well known in 1811. Then 1813, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, 1814, Emma, 1815, Persuasion, 1818, and Northanger Abbey, 1818. So pretty amazing, and that was all in her 30s and early 40s. But she grew up in England, and the thing that struck me, I was kind of curious because I never read Pride and Prejudice. We read Jane Eyre, and I was getting Jane Austen and Jane Eyre confused. Jane Eyre was a book. But this, in one list I saw, that about 1,000 people were ranked novels that should be in schools, or that children should read, or youth should read in school. And Pride and Prejudice was number 15 out of a list of 50. So pretty well respected, and it really tells a moral tale, but fairly, again, not in your face. They kind of talk about how Austen was not preachy in her writing, but yet she had a moral. And in Pride and Prejudice, they first titled the book First Impressions, because it's basically a kind of a romantic comedy about a woman who meets a young man. She's totally turned off by him. He's very wealthy. He's like the most eligible bachelor, somebody that most people, any woman would be crazy to pass up. Yet she rejected him because of his qualities, of her judgment of him initially, her first impressions. But yet throughout, they eventually overcome these things. She learns a lot about herself. They both do. I think it's Elizabeth Bennet is the main character, and is it Darcy that's the other Mr. Darcy? But they end up falling in love, and she kind of has this enlightenment of coming to realize these prejudices that she had, these bad first impressions, and her issues that led to these impressions, her family issues, her own pride. So kind of a moment of enlightenment. And so in all of her books, there tended to be kind of this development. So it wasn't unusual that she would kind of set this kind of moral virtue where her heroes were not flashy, they weren't necessarily saints, but they had good characteristics. And her monsters weren't her villains, so to speak, in her books were not these kind of over the top kind of monsters and evil people. Kind of showing a more ordinariness and goodness, but also in potential for evil or bad. And so, she really talks about not seeing morality as duty and obligation, but just these essential elements of what it means to be a good person, and that those are things we should pass on. And she got this from her religious upbringing. They kind of say because religion was not real upfront in her books, that a lot of people assume she wasn't a religious person. But she actually was a middle of the road, kind of balanced Anglican, a church attending in her time in the early 1800s. And that had a big part of her influence on her. In fact, when she died at the age of 41, they found one prayer book that she had written that showed a lot of depth to her faith, and based off of the Anglican Book of Common Prayer, which had influenced her own upbringing as well. they talked about she really in the Pride and Prejudice values and upholds the virtue of constancy, which I appreciated. She came to realize her need for it when she had that enlightenment, the character Elizabeth Bennet. And she wants to grow in that. So this idea of kind of being rooted in values that persist beyond the present moment, these lasting values. And so she contrasts that with what she would say to be a less appealing but yet highly valued trait by the secular world of charm. And so she would kind of pose charm as this ability to attract attention without necessarily having the quality one appears to possess. So make a good first impression but have no depth. Whereas she said that a lot of times it's the person that doesn't make a good first impression, doesn't have the showy charm that wins somebody over initially, but yet has great depth beyond that. So being charm is all about being socially acceptable rather than actually possessing admirable traits. And so it is concerned with how things look on the outside rather than how they truly are. And so we come to see in her novels the great charm is a person we later learn has poor or deficient character. And then sometimes the person who has few style points eventually is revealed to be the person with strong personality and depth of character. And that's the Mr. Darcy is an example of that in the Pride and Prejudice, the male protagonist. Again, another thing, I never read this book, but it certainly makes me want to get exposure to it. Never watched the movies or anything, but might have to check those out. And grateful for this masterpiece. And again, a masterpiece maybe many of you and us did read through your high school or curriculum or college curriculum. So that's it for our 30th masterpiece, Pride and Prejudice, a novel, 1813. Our next one will be number 31, The Wanderer Above the Sea Fog. It is a painting from 1818, painted by Caspar David Friedrich, who again, I'm not familiar with this painting, so I look forward to learning more about it with you. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day and God bless.